Street Fighter V's competitive life has come to a close, and with the last Capcom Cup being the celebration it was, I'd say it went out with a bang. But after Capcom Cup, an interesting conversation started popping up. Who is the greatest? Well, obviously, it's easy to say it's Mena RD, the only two-time Capcom Cup champion, but I think the conversation is a bit more nuanced than that. I want to talk about who is the greatest Street Fighter V player of all time. Now, there's a lot that goes into establishing the GOAT status, and I want to make sure we're on the same page moving forward. To figure out who's deserving of this title, I'll be looking at 3 specific metrics and weighing the results by the end. The metrics we'll be looking at are tournament results, invitationals, and influence. I'll get further into what each of those mean when we get to them, but to start, let's just dive right in. The first metric we're going to look at is the most obvious one, results. This is the most important way to figure out who the GOAT is, since it could potentially give us an objective answer right off the bat. Results over time can also help us figure out what players have maintained continued greatness over those who shine for shorter periods of time. As one more stipulation, we will only be looking at tournaments recognized by the Capcom Pro Tour for this one, just to keep the caliber of tournaments consistent. Getting good results consistently is a more realistic and valuable skill in my eyes than winning tournaments and not making it to the grand stage most of the other times. The CPT rewards players a certain amount of points for certain placings in premier and regional tournaments throughout the season. This point system incentivizes players always being at the top of the game even if they don't win, and in fighting games, nobody can win everything, but they can try. So, one year had a different structure than the others after it, and it was 2016. 2016 worked off of an auto-qualifying structure, as opposed to the total number of points accrued through the season. I've gone in and assessed what those point values would have looked like for the top 16 ranked players, and for the first Street Fighter V Pro Tour, the numbers looked like this. While making this, these results actually came as a bit of a surprise to me. For reasons we won't get into, Infiltration hasn't been competing much lately, so it's kind of wild to see how much he was dominating back in 2016. Infiltration had a total of 2,260 points just from winning premieres, and realistically, the only player who was even close was Tokido. With the point structure, Tokido was about one major win away from overtaking Infiltration, but that's a huge task for anyone. 2016 was Street Fighter V's first year as a competitive game, so the meta was still being refined and players were learning the ins and outs of the game. For anyone to be this dominant back then is saying a hell of a lot.
Okay, I can explain this. Download complete.
Out of the 6 premier events Infiltration attended, he won 3 and placed top 8 in 5 of them. As mentioned, Tokido was next on the list, and initially my pick for the dominant player of 2016, because that's just how I remembered it. His stats are no joke either. Tokido attended 1 more premiere than Infiltration and placed top 8 in 6 out of those 7. Funnily enough, on 2 occasions where he got second, it was to Infiltration, so the only person stopping Tokido from being the #1 seed that year was Infiltration himself.
Maybe you can kill? No!
Not quite!
Tokido.
And he does it! He does it! He qualifies for Capcom Cup with a perfect! Tokido has done it! He has done it! He's qualified here at CEO with a perfect! And you can see the elation!
Moving on to 2017, Street Fighter V has hit a new stride. Newer and younger players are starting to pick up their sticks and make waves. The first few tournaments of the year are won by familiar names from the year before, like Cien and Haitani. But the third major of 2017 is a bit different. Punk makes a huge splash in the NorCal Regionals and enters the running for the GOAT discussion. Punk's name was on the map already, as he'd won regional tournaments in the past and placed 3rd in the CPT North America Regional Finals, losing to NuckleDu just a year before. And here, at the NorCal Regionals, he got a chance to redeem himself. NuckleDu was obviously the favorite to win here as the reigning Capcom Cup champion, but damn, that is not how this went. For reference, Street Fighter V at this time had a ton of native input lag. On top of that, many tournament setups would add to the overall lag, making things like hit confirming very difficult. But that didn't deter Punk. He would consistently confirm crouch medium kick into a combo, and it put an insane amount of pressure on his opponent that they normally wouldn't be used to. Couple this with his ability to whiff punish and react to fireballs, and Punk in 2017 looked unstoppable, even against the Capcom Cup champ.
He's dead.
He is better than dead.
He is.
Through the year, Punk attended 6 ranking events, of which he won 4. He got second at the other 2, bringing his total to 740 points just from his regional events in America. He also attended 6 major tournaments and won 2 of those, while garnering second place at EVO and CEO, the 2 biggest premieres on the tour. By the end of the season, Punk ended up with 3,080 points, which up to this point was a number nobody had seen before or probably even thought possible. Following close behind him, we see another familiar face, Tokido. Tokido's season was incredible, don't get me wrong. First and second places all over the place, beginning 1,000 points from EVO, definitely boosted his placements up a ton.
In Japan, is there anybody at home or is there anybody that you want to give a shout out to?
Just one thing I want to say. Fighting game is something so great.
Overall, the 2017 season didn't bring about too many surprises, except for one.
Tokido has to stay alive. He can't get touched. If that big boy, he does it.
This is our next entry into the list for the GOAT discussion. Mena RD qualified for Capcom Cup through his placings in mostly regional tournaments and a few majors, and yet he ended up taking home the Capcom Cup on December 10, 2017. If anyone was running fantasy brackets, I don't think anybody could have seen that coming. Mena RD's run that night was frighteningly confident, and it seemed as if nobody had a chance at stopping him. On that night, he was the greatest player in the world. But how does that translate to all time? Let's dig a little deeper. In 2018, we got Arcade Edition and a revitalized CPT. Arcade Edition fixed many of the issues with Street Fighter V casually and competitively, ushering a new wave of excitement about Street Fighter. Players like Big Bird and CJ Truth began ranking globally around this time, but the top of the rankings for 2018 looked pretty much the same as the years before. Once again, Tokido is right at the top, but this time, he's number 1 as opposed to number 2. His point total is also staggeringly high. The reason for that is because Tokido actually made it to the grand finals of 9 of the 11 majors he attended. And from what I can tell, he might not have actually attended Versus Fighting that year and just took a DQ. That means in 2018, if Tokido was at a tournament, there was a 90% chance you'd see him in the grand finals. There's almost no way this should be possible, but apparently it was. Tokido wanted to be the best, and he went to what seems like all lengths to get there.
Tokyo Game Show point here, $50,000 point for
I think they're going to have to change the name to the Tokido Game Show.
That's it, TGS, baby.
Point, yeah.
This is his.
And now, for the last bit of this portion, we arrive at 2019. Punk wasn't too active in tournaments during 2018, as he qualified for Capcom Cup pretty swiftly and didn't need to push himself through the season in order to make it to his end goal. But in 2019, his approach seemed to completely change. It was easy to doubt Punk's skill in fighting games before this year, but afterwards, he reminded everyone why he thought he was the best in the world. He attended 10 CPT major tournaments this year and was in grand finals for 7 of those 10. Maybe not as crazy as Tokido's accomplishments from the year before, but Punk was also in the grand finals of 5 regional ranking tournaments as well. He was grinding, and it was clear that this was his main focus in life at the time. In 2019, for the first time in the history of Street Fighter V, Tokido was no longer a top 2 contender in the global rankings, as he was outdone by another Japanese player by the name of Fujimura. Fujimura went by a different name in the past, but he took the world by storm with his Ibuki, becoming possibly the most feared player in the entire world. This is what the final rankings for 2019 looks like, and there's not too much surprise here either. But if we head towards the bottom of the rankings, there is one player this year aiming to make a big splash, and that's Idom. Up until this point, Idom's name was known, but after Capcom Cup, he became the #1 target to attack for every other player in the world. Because of the unforeseen consequences of the global pandemic, we have to fast forward to 2022. We'll talk about the other years in the next section, but in 2022, we were finally able to return to offline tournaments, and what a year it was. All the qualifying tournaments for Capcom Cup spots were still online tournaments, except for EVO. At EVO Grand Finals, Idom had what is possibly the craziest losers run, going through a gauntlet of FGC legends, only to come up just a hair short against Kawano.
Idom, who was sent to losers pretty early actually by Ryan Hart.
That's right.
After beating Book and Squall, has taken out Joey, Terrence, also Denkadius, JB, Cien, Angry Bird, that's all before top 8. In top 8, Mr. Crimson, Daigo Umehara, Tokido, and Gachikun. That is a list right there.
Idom's run when things were up and running again is insane, outside of just EVO. He won Combo Breaker and CEO before Evolution, and then went on to win East Coast Throwdown and Defend the North later on, which pretty much cemented him as the best tournament player in the entire United States for that year. He qualified for Capcom Cup itself pretty much by the skin of his teeth in the US East Regional Final. Lastly, he proceeded to place 3rd in Capcom Cup, which was probably the hardest competition of Street Fighter V's whole lifespan. So now that we're caught up in bracket results, we have a few contenders in the discussion for the greatest players of all time. There's Infiltration, the early powerhouse of Street Fighter V, Tokido, the demon of consistency, Punk, the Wunderkind of Footsies, Mena RD, the Dominican Bull, and Idom, the offensive juggernaut nobody could stop. Tallying all the results over the years of competition in CPT tournaments, and this is what they walk away with. Right off the bat, there's 2 players we can eliminate from the discussion for just results. This isn't because these players didn't place well enough. If we want to determine the greatest players of all time, we need to factor in how long these guys have been playing. We're only looking at a window of about 6 to 7 years, so it's not crazy to say players who have been playing for longer deserve to have that weighted in their favor. Unfortunately, that means we have to say goodbye to Infiltration since he didn't compete in later seasons, and goodbye to Idom since he got a pretty late start at the highest level. Taking all of that into account, we're left with Tokido, Punk, and Mena RD. Tokido stands way above these two in points for bracket results to the point where I was tempted to end my investigation right here. But then I realized, globally, there are more competitions than those in the CPT that can be taken into account here.
Finds the hit. Strong activates it, and he dropped the DP.
Missed the combo.
And that could be the tournament point. Punk goes on your Invitational champion over Phenom. What?
Now, there's a long-running debate about whether Invitationals are more important than open bracket tournaments and whatnot, but that's not what I want to discuss today. I want to talk about how these 3 players, the top contenders for GOAT status, did at top-level Invitationals, and use those numbers to weigh into their final scores. To clarify, I'd consider an Invitational worthy of speaking about if it has 6 or more players that have qualified for Capcom Cup in the past, or if they qualified for Capcom Cup in the near future. I choose 6 because if an Invitational has an 8-man bracket, they usually invite players from the country that's hosting, even if they didn't qualify for Capcom Cup. The next step was to dig into the Invitational runs of each of these 3 players from the start of Street Fighter V's life until now in 2023. For our purposes, Invitationals are rated on a scale from 1 to 10. A score of 1 indicates only 6 Capcom Cup qualified players, and a score of 10 indicates anything upwards of 60, which would be reserved for pretty much just Capcom Cup 9. And for one last thing, I will be including the online regional finals these players won. I know these tournaments weren't Invitationals, but they wouldn't count the same way CPT events did anyways, since they were region locked. This is pretty much the only way to include those events into these results, while also rewarding players for winning in harder regions. Last thing, players will only be rewarded for podium placements in these tournaments. Making it to top 8 of an Invitational is a different story than doing so for an open bracket, since there's less in your way of getting there. First place will get 100% of the points for that event, second will get 50%, and third place gets 33%. Let's get into the results. As an example, since I just threw a lot of rules at you, I want to talk about something I don't think I understood back in 2016 when it was happening. Tokido attended an event called the Red Bull Battlegrounds in 2016, which was technically a CPT ranking event, but it was also an invitational because only players who qualified through regional events could attend. Tokido had to force his way into the bracket through an open bracket last chance qualifier. The bracket hosted 512 contestants, and Tokido came out in first place. Then, the next day, he went on to get second in the main tournament over players like Justin Wong, RB, Jawa, and even Punk, who got third. At this tournament, there were at least 12 players of Capcom Cup level, granting the tournament a score of 2. Since Tokido got second, he walks away with 1 point, and Punk getting third grants him 0.66 points. After totaling the results for the Invitationals in which these 3 players got third or higher, here's the results we have. Tokido comes out with 27 extra points from this section. Many top players have come to a consensus that Japan is pretty much the strongest region for Street Fighter V, so we can argue for or against it, but at the end of the day, they've got a crazy high number of players who have qualified for Capcom Cup, and it's much higher than any other region, let alone country of that size. Tokido's consistent placements garner him more points than both Punk and Mena RD with ease, even though he didn't qualify for Capcom Cup after the pandemic like they both did. But that's kind of the point. Japan is full of so many killers that even Tokido, who is possibly the best of all time, couldn't make it out of there alive. To get deeper into the other results, Punk's results got him another 13.5 points, and Mena's get him 21. Mena didn't have a lot of opportunity to gain points here during the online era because the Latin American Invitationals don't include a lot of Capcom Cup qualified players. But even still, he wasn't far behind Tokido, which is remarkable to say the least. Winning Capcom Cup twice is something that's never been done before, and for him to do it hailing from a region without many international results is absolutely baffling. On any given night, he has without a doubt been the strongest Street Fighter player in the world, and the same can definitely be said about Punk. But we're looking for staying power that lasts and persists throughout the game's life and can be backed up with results. As it stands, Punk doesn't have that. He's been the best for a year or two, and at times his competitive drive wasn't totally in Street Fighter. But I think he's got something over Tokido. His influence.
But you know, I had to teabag him. I gotta show him who's the alpha.
That was crazy! He said, you know, I gotta put these kids in their place.
At this point, I know I've given people enough to be mad at me for or fodder for the comments section, but hear me out. At this point, on paper, it's pretty much decided that Tokido is the greatest of all time. He's got literally everyone beat in CPT results, and his invitational stats are just too strong and consistent for pretty much anyone to get close. But what I want to talk about now is how many people want to play like Tokido? How many have been directly inspired by him? It's a bit of a loaded question, but think about this. If I were to ask you who the greatest Street Fighter V player of all time was before you saw these numbers, what would you have said? For many, it would have been Punk. I know thousands were thinking it was Mena RD, and there were definitely people thinking Idom or Daigo as well. But I'm almost positive that not many were thinking Tokido. And that's because Tokido doesn't pass the eye test in major tournaments. Basically, if you've already mentally chosen your greatest of all time, you'll watch them more and notice their accomplishments more often than other players who might beat them out in terms of metrics. Tokido on the grand stage is a pretty quiet guy who takes his wins well and his losses better, so there's not really much to think about when we see him, especially since he's been doing it for so long. But players like Punk and Mena wear their feelings on their sleeves. We can see how hard the losses hit them and how gratifying the wins feel for them. The eye test might not seem important, but in answering the question of who is the greatest of all time, it does carry some weight.
Thought that I stopped playing Karen, then I stopped caring. This game too easy, bro. Any tournament I care about, I win that. They see us win too much is normal.
The greatest Street Fighter V player has to be able to influence people to some extent.
What can you say just about this experience as a whole with Team Panda here in Season 5 of Street Fighter League? Street Fighter League is always like a super fun time, especially being on a team with Punk the past couple of years.
We see it with all the greats in other forms of competition. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Messi. Not every GOAT dominates every metric, and in my opinion, if anyone was to refer to Punk as the greatest Street Fighter V player of all time, I wouldn't have any issue with that. Punk completely changed the way Street Fighter V is played and inspired players from around the world to look at the game differently, Japan included.
パンクってもう存在がネタなんですよね、ある意味。どういうことかっていうと、パンクしかできないことが多すぎて、初見マジで負けるんですよ、みんな。
そうなんだ。
そう。だって、だから、これできるの？そんなの聞いてねえよ。だから、できるってことが分かってから対戦すれば、また違った結果になるんですけど。
Not only that, but Punk has helped players grow to reach their full potential by coaching them and being a leader in the community, both publicly and behind closed doors. He's even sponsored players to compete from around the world, and in doing so, he shook up a whole Capcom Cup. From what I've seen, combining those two factors of influence on gameplay and global community, I don't think many, if anybody, comes close to Punk.
Because I'm the best. Say I'm the best. Your whole team should say I'm the best.
So, with all of that said, if you asked who is the greatest Street Fighter V player of all time, and I had to answer, I think I'd have two responses. In terms of metrics, it's Tokido, hands down. But in terms of influence over the game, I think it's gotta be Punk. Now, what you value is totally up to you, and I know that using CPT results isn't perfect, but the FGC is entering a new era. We'll be able to have more international competitions, new players will appear out of the woodworks, and the entire landscape of fighting games will look different in a year or two. As we round out the life of Street Fighter V, I can't wait to see what Street Fighter VI will bring for us, and who will rise to the top of that game as it progresses. That's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.